Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We'll start with today. I have classified this lecture to be occupation and international law. We want really to identify what we mean when we say occupation, ihtilal. All the time we are using ihtilal, and of course for the Israelis, with all the arrogance, they are saying, as a matter of fact, we are not really occupying. We are not occupying power. We are not occupying forces. We are just disputing a land. And this is where they want always to take the Palestinians, using the fake legal terms of talking about disputed lands, rather talking about unoccupied territories. So we will define what we mean when we say occupation, whether we are talking about the occupation in Palestine or occupation in Iraq or occupation in anywhere across the world. Now, according to the international law, occupation, where is the situation being controlled by foreign forces. So if you look at just going a bit away out of Palestine, you will find, for example, the American occupation to Iraq, using the military forces and controlling foreign sovereign countries. And sovereignty, as a matter of fact, it's very important when we identify the elements of the occupation. But we will explain later on, because Israelis are using this actually to say that when we occupied the Palestinian territories, or West Bank and Gaza Strip and the East Jerusalem, it wasn't really occupied from a sovereign state, which is completely wrong. Why? Because Jordan was the controlling power, and it was a sovereign power. And this sovereign power or sovereign state was the case in Gaza Strip, where the Egyptians as well, or Egypt as a sovereign state, independent state, was taking control over Gaza, and in all aspects. Although, by the way, you would consider the Egyptian control over Gaza before 1967 was by itself an occupation. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't change really the legal terms that Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, of course, in addition to the Sinai, in addition to the Golan Heights, all of them, according to the international law, were considered all the time, consistently, without any doubt, they are occupied. They are called all occupied territories. Now, when a territory or parts thereof come under the authority of foreign hostile armed forces, it becomes occupation. This is the basic definition of the occupation. Now, some would tell you, for example, in Iraq, Americans to come and to terminate the Saddam regime, which is completely out of context, because simply, according to the international law, even if there was people carrying the citizens of the same country, like nationals of that country, and called for foreign forces to come and to take over the control, it would be still considered to be an occupation. Even if some people, as it was happening before, something we used to call it the villages unions, Rawabit al-Qura, used to be working with the occupation in order to control, for example, the West Bank. It wasn't the case really in Gaza Strip, but it used to be the case in many places in the West Bank. But despite of this, this doesn't change really the legal position of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and of course Gaza. It is the same in general. We have to consider the fact, even if the Israeli army tried to take control and there was no resistance whatsoever, whether we are talking about non-violent resistance or armed resistance, still it is called occupation. So it's not about really finding the people of the country resisting or not resisting in any ways or in any means. So it's about the definition of international law. Whether some people would tell you, well, but the Palestinian Authority, and this is widely and commonly used by the Israeli propaganda and the Israeli supporters around the world, saying, well, but we had sat on the same table with the Palestinians or with PLO, and then we had the agreement, and this is all about really agreeing with them to have control over some parts of the West Bank, and then we are controlling the other parts of the West Bank. Still, despite of all these agreements, occupation is there. And because it was stated very clearly, even if there is any agreement with any local authorities or with national representatives, as far as the foreign forces having the upper hand and controlling those territories, still will be considered occupation. I hope this is clear to you what is exactly the meaning of occupation, despite of some confusions and the Israeli propaganda. And this is why usually I advise anyone, any politicians, Palestinian politicians, from talking about the PLO or other movements, whether we're talking about Hamas or anyone really using any national or international platform, whether writing especially in English or appearing on the English channels, to talk all the time about the international law. It's not really just about what's happening on the ground. It's about the international law. Gaza is still occupied, West Bank is still occupied, international law still giving them the same status. Nothing has changed and nothing should be changed. And this is one of the main strategies of how we can utilize the strength of the international law in the media. And this is part of our lecture as well, that consistently we have to agree upon something very clear. The message should be conveyed that according to the international law, according to the Security Council resolutions, as it has been clarified last lecture, still all these parts under occupation. Now, before someone stepping in and asking the question why we are just focusing on the occupation of 1967, yes? By then, we have to understand, and we would just introduce some historical facts. When we come to the discussion with Zionists, with the Israelis, usually they will tell you that the Jews used to have a country 3,000 years ago, and they are in a position to claim the rest of the lands. And this is exactly what they are using for the settlements or the illegal settlements. Now, the Palestinians, once they are claiming or achieving the goals of keeping the international recognition of the occupied territories of 1967, they can certainly, if the Israelis are claiming 3,000 years ago, the Palestinians would be in better position to claim what was taken from them as historical Palestine before 1947. So we have to keep this kind of legal way of thinking in our list. So you have to use the same strategy as they are using across the world. And it seems to be sometimes their message is really like is accepted somehow, but recently, like in the last 10 years, we started to feel that there is some serious changes in the public opinions across the Western countries, especially in Europe. Now, we'll go to ask ourselves the question. I identify this. I know the answer. The answer, I know that you know the full answer of this, but just as a matter of like academic approach, we have to answer this in academic way. So is Israel occupying the Palestinian territory, المناطق المحتلة? The answer, of course, yes. And here we come to the point about how we can identify what is the occupation. Here we are talking about 1967. The Israeli armed forces have had the effective authority. You remember I was talking about who is controlling whom. Are we talking about effective authority, control over the Palestinian territory? Yes, it's still there. It's still there. When they argue, they try to promote that Gaza is given the freedom, is given the independence, but unfortunately this was abused by Hamas, which is something out of context. But this kind of propaganda, unfortunately, to some extent is succeeding really to tolerate the Israelis from their crimes against the Palestinians in Gaza. But according to the international law, as far as we have effective authority, effective control, who is controlling the sovereignty of the whole Gaza by controlling the borders are the Israelis. Then the Israelis are still the occupying power over Gaza, as well as, of course, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And when we say East Jerusalem, it doesn't mean, by the way, it doesn't mean that Western Jerusalem or the western part of Jerusalem is not occupied. It was really the default of the Palestinians who didn't start their negotiations of all Jerusalem, because according to Ilan Bibi, he is one of the most famous Israeli historians, modern historians. In many different lectures, we had this discussion with him of the successful strategies of negotiating the Israelis. And he's been always at the position of saying you have to negotiate with them on Tel Aviv. You don't talk with them about Nablus. You don't talk with them about Rafah. You don't talk with them about Hebron. You have to start to talk with them about Tel Aviv. And this is an Israeli modern historian. He's a very famous one. And he had a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, where he explained exactly where the Palestinians should claim their rights. He said then it might be something to talk about the negotiations, but you have to start, and this is the same about Jerusalem, and this is the same where you find your legal terms with regard to the 1967 borders. So you have really to work in all your legal capacity on that position, and then you will have the legal, and because many Palestinians with regard to the right of return, as we have explained last lecture, they have the full right to claim this, and this claim is still alive. And this is very important. So no one really is giving up on that right. And if we are talking just about the right of return, then the whole idea of Jewish state within the 1947, it will collapse gradually. It will be collapsing gradually. No. Now, the effective control would be still considered to be an effective control, even if the occupation or the occupation authority has agreements with some authorities over the territory has been delegated to the Palestinian Authority. If you remember, we have all this what we call it, this loud voices that, you know, agreements with the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority is in charge, the Palestinian Authority is dealing with the Palestinian civil issues, even with some security, even we have handed over a lot of authorities on the health, education, and so on. And this, as a matter of fact, unfortunately, a very huge strategic default committed by the BLO, and this is something we have to focus on. We shouldn't have given this opportunity for the Israelis, because from the first 5 years of something called agreements, it should have been done and finished at 1999. If it didn't work, then everything should be handed over back to the Israelis as an occupying power. Remember, occupying power, because still they are controlling every single aspect of the Palestinian life. We know that the Palestinian president has no authority even to cross a checkpoint. We all know that, and he is unfortunately proud of saying this all the time. So still we have occupation, even if this occupation managed to have an agreement with local representatives or national representatives to have part of the authority handed to them. Now, even when we have something called the annexation or Qanun al-Dam, and the Israelis released a few of them, especially when it comes to Jerusalem. Now they are discussing something serious to annex the West Bank, or a significant space in the West Bank, especially surrounding Jerusalem, or when it comes to the Golan Heights, when they issued the annexation law in 1980 or 1981. I don't exactly remember, but despite of this, international law, and put it in your mind, international law doesn't recognize this, because it is called as being a sovereign act, and the occupying power has no authority to apply its sovereign or its sovereignty on the occupied territories. So whether they annexed, whether they signed an agreement with the Palestinian Authority or with any Palestinian representatives, doesn't mean anything. This is why none of the Arabs, by the way, if we are talking about Camp David with Sadat, they didn't have really any effective power to implement any agreement with the Israelis with regard to the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. So this is because the occupation is occupation. As far as the occupation is still in power, cannot exercise or cannot really confiscate the sovereignty of the occupied people or occupied population. Now, talking to another stage, however, as long as effective control is being exercised, neither delegation of some authority nor annexation can change the legal status of the occupied territories according to the international law. So the status quo, or as it is called, the status quo, it would be staying exactly as the occupation never been there. Remember about this. So any single act, any single implementation, any single practice exercised by the Israeli occupation considered as null, and this is according to the commanding international law rules. And this is where we can say, yes, Palestine Palestinian territories is still under effective Israeli occupation, despite of all the propaganda that trying to promote all the time that they had agreements or peace process which is not existed, and this is would not tolerate or forgive the Israelis from the definition of being the occupying power over the Palestinian people. Now, we go to the next one, and we say, or we ask the question, or we try to answer the question, which international laws apply during an occupation? Any occupation, we have two simple questions, two simple answers, which we have, if you remember, mentioned them in last week. The two laws, two obvious laws, international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The law of war, and this is usually would be used actually after the war. So this law, this specific law, wouldn't really be in a position to discuss who started the war, what is the reason behind the occupation, whether you have historical claim, whether you have political claims, it doesn't matter. But the most important thing that this law will be implemented after the war, after the war is taking place and even finished. So we are talking about, remember, two things: international humanitarian law or the law of war, or international human rights law. And you will see, despite the fact of many Palestinians, Arabs and Palestinian supporters, they don't believe that much that Israel is giving any weight for the Palestinian human rights. You will see that in many different occasions, documenting every single abuse committed by the Israelis, whether during the war or the war act, during the clashes with the Israelis, during to any kind of occupying expression done by the Israelis or the Israeli forces should be documented for this sake. And you will see why the Israelis are pushing too much with the Americans and maybe with many other countries, pushing the Palestinians or pressurizing the Palestinians not to go to the International Criminal Court. Later on we will see what is the importance of the international human rights law, which is completely would be implemented on the Palestinian situation in every time and in every aspect. Now, what are the main principles concerning the law of occupation? So we will focus somehow on like the actual terms that should be followed by the occupation after the occupation is happening, because under the international law, if you are occupying another population or another territories, it doesn't mean that you don't have commitment because simply you are occupying them because they are your enemies, or you are occupying them because they are attacking you, or they are really like doing harm to you. No. As long as you decided to occupy them and your occupation is taking place, then you have responsibilities, and those responsibilities were stated clearly in the international law in many different rules, in many different aspects and statements. Now, the central notions under the law of occupation, that an occupying power must administer the territory, and focus here, we have to highlight this, administer the territory for the benefit of the local population. And this is never have been done or committed by the Israelis. They never really administered the occupied territories to benefit the Palestinian people. And this is where we say all the time, every single documentation of every single abuse and the practice by the Israelis, and nowadays, mashallah, everyone has a camera and has this kind of facilities to record with photos and with videos, with many different facilities and tools. So it is really very, very crucial and very important, because they are every day breaking one of the main rules, that they should administer the territories for the benefit of the local population. This is one. And in general, to maintain the status quo in the occupied territories. And this is why we said last time, when it came to Jerusalem, changing the legal status is not really their decision. Neither the decision of the American administration or any superpower in this war. Whatever they take as in practical measures, it doesn't mean anything. And this is something where the Palestinians should put in mind. In addition to using every single possible means to liberate Jerusalem, to liberate the Palestinian territories, but they have to put in mind that they have the full right, as this is breaking the international law or the practices of the Israeli forces, authorities as occupying power, is still breaking the law. So the Palestinians, they have the full right to oppose this and to fight against it. Now, the status quo should be there, and this means that the occupying power shouldn't act as being a sovereign power over the territories. So there is no any sovereignty over the occupied territories or the occupied population. Why? Because simply international law is telling you, you are as having a temporary authority. You are there temporarily. Although some people may say, well, they've been there for the last 70 years. Even if you stayed for the last 200 or 300 years, still you are occupying power. You are occupying other people. You are occupying another foreign territories. And this is where the Palestinians shouldn't give up, because whatever they claim to be a sovereign act, it doesn't mean anything under the international law. Now, in addition to that, they have to, or they must, protect, respect, and enhance the rights of the protected occupied population. Any single right, especially when it comes to the definition of the human rights, starting from the basic rights of the Palestinians, it is a duty, it is a must on the occupying power to protect those rights and to make sure that those rights are not abused. And this is something is not happening, it never happened in the Palestinian territories, although the Israelis sometimes are trying to tweak the situation and to report that no, we are giving the Palestinians some movement here and there. So it's very important as well here to remember that everything should be really documented, because this kind of documentation is very important, and it might be a crucial to prove that, because sometime you will be surprised if you take a legal case and you are thinking that everyone should know about your legal case, about your situation, but when you go to the court, and I'm talking here about the International Criminal Court, if you are going to the court without documentation, you are risking to lose the whole case, because they wouldn't recognize anything really verbal. It has to be documented, and it has to be submitted with full documentation. So any single abuse with regard to the protection, respecting and enhancing the rights of the Palestinians should be always carefully documented, so it can be used in the future against the Israeli occupation and their practices. Now, we will come to Geneva. If you remember, we have asked you to prepare something about Geneva Conventions. And why I focused on Geneva Convention, because every single aspect of the occupation and the occupying powers abuses are fully documented in that Geneva Convention, which was, as you can see, which was issued and agreed upon on August 1949. But then during the coming years, a lot of additions were added actually to enrich and to modify the convention in order to protect or to give more protection for the civilians who are the victims of occupation, or they are caught in a war and fighting situations. Now we start in a simple terms, something I know all of you know about it, but we have to remind you, whatever you know, and whatever you believe, it's not documented and recognized by the law, it doesn't mean anything. It means something emotionally, it means something related to your national feelings, but it doesn't mean anything legally. So we have to be very careful when we read through the international rules, and well, it is similar to the national laws as well, but here our case is about Geneva. So we start, of course, every single part of Geneva Convention is very meaningful towards the Palestinian situation, but I tried, because the time restrictions restraining me from really reporting every single point and discuss it in this space of time. But I will go through the the main articles reflecting the Palestinian situation. So starting from Article 31, saying no physical or moral coercion shall be exercised against the protected persons, in particular to obtain information from them or from third parties. So we start with, even when it comes to the morality here becomes law. So humiliating people under occupation, whether we're talking about collective humiliation or individual humiliation, is something prohibited under Geneva Convention. Imagine its focus taking place in every single details of the daily life of the people under occupation everywhere. Now, the following article talking about the high contracting parties, we call them in Arabic al-atraf al-muta'aqida, especially agree that each of them is prohibited from taking any measure of such a character as to cause the physical suffering or extermination of protected persons in their hands. So no one of the occupying forces have or has any authority to even harm physically or emotionally, because we're talking about the moral dimension as well, or enforcing them to do something against their will. Then this prohibition applies not only to the murder, torture, corporal punishment. So it's not really something we call it, although we will focus later on the torture, because it is something where we can really focus a lot and then gain some serious issues, especially when it comes to the European legal system. But here, with this regard, when we say physical, it doesn't mean the torture. Even like slapping someone on face, it's called physical. Punching someone on face, it is called physical. Or kicking someone in the legs, it's called physical. So imagine how accurate, how important to really document every single abuse done when the Palestinians, for especially in Gaza, going through Beit Hanun checkpoint. Every single abuse should be documented and should be kept to be used in the future against them when it comes really to the trial or to the criminal courts. Now, the same will be coming to mutilation and medical or scientific experiments not necessitated by the medical treatment, so they wouldn't be or they shouldn't be subject to any medical abuses as well. So you would imagine that there is accuracy of describing every single act or abuse by the occupying power. So it's not a simple issue to say, well, they do this everywhere, they do this every day, they do this with everyone. No, it's about whenever it's happening, and this is why sometimes I tolerate and I accept many of the NGOs who are working on the ground and trying to document every single move and abuse done by the Israeli and the Israeli soldiers. It's something very important, something really can achieve something. That day, I remember, although it's a bit out of our discussion, Fawzi al-Muhtasib or Fawzi al-Hashlamon, that young boy, 14 years, I think you remember very well, he was arrested by 23 soldiers. It did really make a huge impact on the European public opinion. There was a huge discussion. There was a huge disgrace by the English, the French, the Italians, name it, everyone. Yes, Fawzi al-Junaidi. It was really crucial, and many, they were calling the radios. Imagine, they were calling the radios, asking for this occupation to finish, this disgusting act against the Palestinian children to be stopped, asking for them to be brought to the courts and so on. So this kind of things, documenting this kind of things could make difference. And the Israeli spokesman and the Israeli supporters, really, they couldn't even, they put themselves in a very critical position. So in addition to the media, we have something very important with regard to the legal cases. Legal cases can do a lot with the documentation, but just reporting this verbally, it doesn't mean anything. Just talking about the suffering, it doesn't mean anything. It means for us, but it doesn't mean anything for or in a legal term. So we have really to be very careful when it comes to not saying, wow, this is not going to achieve anything. This is, no, it's very important, because as you can see in the Geneva Convention, they are focusing in every single treatment received under occupation by the occupying forces. Now, no protected person may be punished. When we say protected person, it means the people under occupation. And protected person is used accurately just to explain all the time that everyone under occupation is a protected person automatically by nature. So naturally they are all protected. Any abuse against those people, it means you are breaking this legal protection. Imagine when we say legally protected, no one can touch or breach this kind of protection. So no protected person may be punished for an offense he or she has not personally committed. Here talking about the widely and commonly practiced acts by the Israelis when they punish the whole village or the whole town or the whole camp, or even the whole area, like what happened with Gaza. They have specific groups who are resistance groups defending the Palestinian people, but despite of this, instead of just reacting against them specifically, they are punishing all the people. So this is as well a breach of the protection. Collective penalties and likewise all measures of intimidation of terrorism are prohibited. So every single act, as a matter of fact, will be considered as a terrorist act by the Israeli forces, and this is something we have to focus upon, that any breach of the international law, it is an act of terror. We have to remember this very, very well. Of course, the village violence, especially in wartime, is prohibited. You can't do any violence, or you can't use any violence against the protected people. In this case, as a protected people, remember, everyone under occupation. Reprisal, the retaliation, al-intiqam, is not really something allowed according to the international law, specifically Geneva Convention. Taking hostages, as they do usually. They are arresting a lot of people, sometimes all the family, in order to someone really to submit for or to surrender for the Israeli forces. This is this happened in Gaza many times, but it's happening almost every day in the West Bank. This is breaking, and this is where every case should be documented. Aliens in the territory of a party to the conflict, talking about the people who are in the area when the war is breaking or taking place. Here is telling you as simple as that. Even under the war, you can't limit the movement of the people, of leaving the territories or coming to or enter the territories, whether they are caught in the war zone or they are really out of the war zone, whether at the beginning, whether at the middle, or at the end of the war. So you can't restrict the movement of the people, and this is exactly what's happening in Gaza, and this is what's happening from time to time in the West Bank, where you have a lot of restrictions put on the Palestinians and prevented from moving anywhere, despite the fact that the Israelis sometimes putting the checkpoints, which is in this case Rafah and Beit Hanun, but the situation according to the international law is completely different, and both of them are illegal, and they have to grant the Palestinians the entry and the leaving possibilities all the time, whether we are talking about the emergency or we are talking about the normal situation where there is no armed clashes between the fighting parties. Those persons permitted to leave may provide themselves with the necessary funds for their journey. Even they have to be granted the expenses for the journey. If they don't have the expenses, then the occupying power should provide them with the transportation, and this is of course not happening. Although we are talking about something ideal, يعني with this kind of مثالية, but as a matter of fact, it is something good to be documented then to be used, because it's breaking this convention, and this convention, as you would see, it will be referred to all the time in the International Criminal Court statute, the charter of that court, which is very, very important to remember all the time what we can do when it comes to the International Criminal Court. More rights and abuses. The protected persons who are confined pending proceedings or serving a sentence involving loss of liberty shall during their confinement be humanely treated, and this is related to the to the arrested people. Anyone really is arrested should be completely treated in a human way. And this is where it's very important to document every single case of abuse against the Palestinian prisoners and against the Palestinian detainees. As soon as they are released, they may ask to leave the territory in conformity with the foregoing articles, and this is the same. They must not be really limited or restricted of movement after they've been released, which is something really practiced completely the opposite by the Israelis, because they stop the Palestinian. Once you are arrested, then it's very difficult for you to be allowed to move within and outside the Palestinian territories, which is something against the international law. Now, the occupied territories and how this will be treated before it was about the protected persons, the human beings, and now it's about the geographical, how they deal with the geographical areas under occupation. The same will continue with the articles of Geneva Conventions. Protected persons who are in occupied territory shall not be deprived in any case or any manner whatsoever of the benefits of the present convention. And this is something very serious. So every single detail in this convention should be highly respected and should be protected by the occupying power. Where the Israelis are the occupying power, then they have to provide all the rules. And I think we did a huge mistake, because Palestinians always mentioning Geneva Conventions, but they never really went, for example, apart from once or twice, they went to the protecting power, which is Switzerland in this case, and asking them to reinforce the Geneva Conventions. But for the Palestinians, they should have even gone to the European courts, where in the European courts they are all signatories, parties, أطراف متعاقدة. They should bring the Israeli officials, Israeli politicians to the courts. If they can't do this physically, at least they will prevent them from coming to Europe. They are not free to do whatever they want to break the international law, and then they feel safe. And this is something, unfortunately, we haven't done as Palestinians, and we never paid attention to that, apart from talking about this in the media. So again, convention by any change introduced as the result of occupation of a territory. Whatever really has changed after the occupation, it shouldn't be considered as related to the reality. So whatever they do, for example, they change the law, it shouldn't be considered. Still, once the occupation is done, everything should be treated as if never the occupation was there. And it would be the same when it comes to imposing new rules on the occupied territories. It would be considered the same, as they are unlawful and illegal. Now into the institutions or government of the said territory, nor by any agreement concluded between the authorities of the occupied territories and the occupying power. And this is exactly like summarizing, it's a summary of summarizing the position of the Palestinian Authority now, or the authorities in Gaza, whatever really linked to this situation. There is nothing would deprive the Palestinians from their rights according to the international law, even if they find any Palestinian leader telling them, well, we have to give up this, to give up this, to give up this. It doesn't mean anything. And this is stated very clearly in this article. Remember, article number 47 in Geneva Convention, saying that any agreement with the national authority or national representative doesn't change the legal situation and position of the occupied territories and occupied under or the people under occupation. It doesn't mean anything unless they get really all what they wanted, nor by any annexation by the letter of the whole of the part of the occupied territory. The same about the Israelis when they decided to make the annexation, and they are planning, of course, to do more of that by passing some enactment in the Knesset, which is, as you can see, is not really considered to be legal under any circumstance. So whatever the Israelis are trying to do, whatever the Israelis are trying really to impose on the Palestinians, is still, you have to remember, is not really valid under the international trend of our discussion. So we would find in the same convention talking about the individual or mass forcible transfers. If you remember last time we had this link between the right of return and the deportations, because usually any case related to the whether we are talking about just persons, individuals, or talking about many different people, and this is in addition to what happened in 1967 and what happened in 1947, we would have the same cases happening, for example, in the Jordan Valley, where we call it الأغوار الفلسطينية, and we have many different areas nearby the Israeli illegal settlements are practiced and widely known, but we don't seem to have really the strategy to talk about this on the international level. The Europeans are actually doing much more than the Palestinian Authority is doing, or the Palestinians themselves are doing. So it has to be considered, because according to the international law, they can't really just decide anytime, even for military reasons or security reasons. They have very limited authority to remove the people or to enforce them to be transferred to another territories. Now, something related to the illegal settlers and illegal settlements, which is strictly prohibited by saying occupying power, Israel in this case, shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies, which is something happening every single day. So it's not enough to say illegal settlements. We have to be reporting every single case happening every day, whether we are talking about a small number of settlers or we are talking about a mass transportation of those settlers into the Palestinian territories, whether we are talking really about what we call it the public lands or talking about the private lands. It doesn't matter. What matters, they are Palestinian areas, and whatever the justification of the Israelis, it should be more actually raised from the legal point of view. And this is, if you can notice that the Europeans are doing much more work when it comes to the settlements, because still they are recognizing the international law that implemented or applied on the illegal settlements. So this is another thing we can really like persecute the Israelis and chase them upon them, the settlers and the settlements. The same, you will find any destruction by the occupying power of real or personal property belonging individually or collectively to private persons or to the state or to other public authorities or to social or cooperative organization is prohibited. All the attacks on Gaza were involved a mass destruction of schools, hospitals, or charities, civilian houses, individual properties, governmental institutions, universities, everything should be documented. And this is why I think the Israelis are putting too much pressure against the Palestinians or on the Palestinian Authority, and I think they are succeeding in doing that because they don't want them really to go there, because every single case would be by itself considered to be a crime, whatever the reason and the justification by the Israelis. The same in Article 81, parties to the conflict who in turn protected persons shall be bound to provide free of charge for their maintenance. And this is about the situation of the arrested people, the Palestinian detainees. They are deprived of every single human rights, especially when it comes, for example, now we know that many of the Palestinian prisoners are required really to pay for their imprisonments in the prison, despite the fact that international law is like making it as a duty of the occupying or detaining power, Israel, to pay for all their maintenance and nothing really to be taken from those prisoners. And in addition to that, when they put the fines and punish the Palestinian prisoners, it's also against the international law. And this is not really documented by the Palestinians. We are not doing that much. We're reporting this in the, what we call it, in the media, and usually the local media, and none of the English speaking or French speaking or the international languages would know anything about this. And all of these things should be reported and documented. The same, no deduction from the allowances, salaries or credits due to the interest shall be made for the repayment of these costs. Everything. Now we are talking about the 5 stars occupation, and this is actually a main contribution of the Palestinians. This is where the Palestinians are making the occupation much easier for the Israelis. It has to be much more expensive. It has to be costly. That detaining power shall provide for the support of those dependent on the internees. And imagine that according to the international law, that if you have a poor family and someone is dependent on the prisoner and they don't have really enough income, this authority here, Israel, should really provide and pay them the money. So now we are paying for our imprisonment, and the Palestinian Authority, unfortunately, they stepped in and they started even to pay for every prisoner. This should have been done according to the international law, and the Israelis, they should have paid. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure the arrest of the Palestinians will be much lower, and the arrest of the Palestinians will be in completely different conditions. But I know I am in a position to know that none of these things are reported or spoken about. Protected persons accused of offenses shall be detained in occupied country, and if convicted should be serving the sentences in the occupied country. This is not happening. You know that the Palestinian prisoners from Gaza, they are detained now and serving their terms inside Israel. This is against the international law, and unfortunately when they signed Oslo agreement, they didn't do anything about this, and they didn't ask for this to be according to the international law. And this is what happened exactly with the Palestinian prisoners in the West Bank. Apart from Ofar, the prison called Ofar, we have all the Palestinian prisoners are detained and serving their terms in, and this is now considered to be a war crime, Jarimat Harb, to move the Palestinian prisoners from the Palestinian areas. And this is where I think we have a huge default, and we don't really do any favor to ourselves by following the Palestinian, by following the international rules. Throughout the duration of their interim members of the same family, we hear a lot of stories about the Palestinian, the prisoner separation, the father with the son, or the mother with the daughter. It's happening all the time, that we have a lot of inhuman treatment of the prisoners by separating the family members from each other. According to the international law, they have to be in the same prison. They have to actually be provided with family conditions to live and to be separated from other prisoners. This is not happening, and no one ever mentioned this in any of the Palestinian statements talking about the prisoners or the Palestinian prisoners. So we are giving really a lot of opportunities for the Israelis to break the international law and not really to do a lot. And I think if we have an organized cases published and used in the European courts, the situation might be different, and someone will be knocking the tank, قرع الخزان, yes, or ringing the bell, قرع الجرس. No one. And it shall be remained prohibited at any time and any place whatsoever the violence to life and persons. No violence should be really practiced against the protected persons, the people under occupation, or killing of all kinds, mutilation, cruel treatment, or torture. Now, I would like to focus somehow on the torture. Murder, we know the murder, الاغتيالات. This is called killing out law, breaking the international law. But we never taken any case to the international court. We never taken any case to the European courts where many of our people were assassinated and killed out of law without any evidence, without anything, despite the fact they are known to be resistance leader, but it doesn't give the Israelis the permission to kill them without any evidence. This is according to the internet. And imagine how many of the Palestinian leaders were killed in the same way, starting from Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, going to Abu Ali Mustafa, all these prominent leaders of the Palestinian resistance. So these cases, as you all know, not reported according to the legal terms, always talking about this kind of political statements and so on. But the Palestinians, I think, should do more when it comes to the legal aspects of this kind of killing, because it is breaking the international law. And I don't know how many of you would hear that the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian organizations are talking about this kind of things by using the legal terms. Now, coming down to the International Criminal Court and making the link between it, between this court, specific court, this is a great court, by the way, if we can use it, and between the Geneva Convention. Now we will come to this link, because we have part of the lecture how we can prosecute the Israelis by using the international law, how we criminalize them, تجريم الاحتلال. Now, this court, just to give a brief idea, started to get place or to take place in 1998, but to be implemented or to take an actual term, it was in 2002, when we have the serious invasions or re-invasions of the Palestinian authorities areas, which is called A territories. The court shall have international legal personality, so it is by itself independent international organization. It shall also have such legal capacity as may be necessary in the exercise of the functions and the fulfillment of its purposes. So they can practice their jurisdiction within Israel as well. I want to make it really, to cut it short. The court may exercise its functions and powers as provided in the statute on the territory of any state party and by special agreement on the territory of any other state. So even if Israel is not a signatory, they are not signatory, they are not part of this court, but still the court can impose their jurisdiction on them as far as they are breaking the rules of this international criminal court. Now, crimes within the jurisdiction of the court. Remember what we were talking about the Geneva and whatever you have read about the Geneva Conventions, and focus somehow with what I'm gonna do to go through now. The court has jurisdiction in accordance with this statute. Statute, it means actually the ميثاق أو قانون أساسي. So القانون الأساسي للمحكمة الجنائية الدولية. With respect to the following crimes: the crime of genocide, and this happened many times, but I have to remind you, as a matter of fact, that the rules of this court would be implemented to any crime happened after 2002, not before. So just to be accurate, from like legally and academically speaking, it would apply. And of course, we know the Israeli record is full of events and full of crimes even after 2002, starting from the invasion of the Palestinian cities and destroying the properties and mass killing, like what happened in Jenin Camp and what happened in Nablus, and then the 3 wars in the last 3 years against Gaza and so on. So we have plenty to take really to take into consideration when it comes to the crimes committed by Israelis after 2002. So we have the crime of genocide. We will define what is the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, and the crime of aggression. The crime of aggression, just to let you know, it's been actually verified just the last few months. So they didn't agree. Why? Because the crime of aggression is crucial for the definition of occupation, because any occupation will be considered to be acting aggressively, will be taking the action of aggression, and by itself it is something would be considered to be international crime. International crime, it means all the signatories, which they are 123 countries signing on this agreement, will be in a place or a position to follow the rules of the criminal court. Now, for the purpose of the statute, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial or religious group, as such killing members of the group. And whatever I'm reading here, you would be imagining this is happening inside Gaza, and this is happening in the Palestinian territories in the other part of the West Bank. So killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And this is exactly what happened with the siege of Gaza. And unfortunately, part of the Palestinian leadership was contributing to this. I hope situation will change, inshallah, with time, but we don't know. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So part of those descriptions would fit what's happening or what happened for the last 10-15 years against Gaza, where you have the food is limited, you have the medical aids are restricted, and I mean huge list really would come under the definition of genocide. So it's very important to understand what is the definition and the description of these terms. Crimes against the humanity, جرائم ضد الإنسانية. For the purpose of the statute, crime against the humanity means any of the following acts when committed as part of a widespread or systematic Attack directed against any civilian population. Here talking, and if you go and you follow accurately what was reported and stated in Geneva Conventions, you will find it talking about almost the same. So Geneva concepts and understanding of the statements are reflected here in the International Criminal Court. So attack directed against any civilian population, this is exactly what happened in Gaza and the West Bank, means a course of conduct involving the multiple commissions of acts referred to in paragraph 1 against any civilian population pursuant to or in furtherance of the state or organization policy to commit such attack. So anything against the civilians will be subject to a case or to build a case and a trial before this criminal court. Murder, murdering the people, which is happening almost every single day, and we have the records on the TVs almost every day. Extermination. Extermination includes the intentional infliction of conditions of life. As we said, this is what's happening with the siege against Gaza. Inter alia, the deprivation of access to food and medicine calculated to bring about the destruction of part of a population. Enslavement, alhamdulillah, something not happening in Palestine at least. Deportation or forcible transfer of population means forced displacement of the persons, which is happening, as I said, in many different villages and Bedouin areas in the Western Bank, and near to Jerusalem, and in the desert near to Hebron as well. Almost every week we have huge stories talking about this and reporting on this, in which they are lawfully present without the grounds permitted under international law. Imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of fundamental rules of international law. So the arrest and the imprisonment happening almost every single day in Palestine, it's breaking the convention of this or the statute of this criminal court. Now, torture. I said we will focus on the torture later on. Torture means the intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, upon a person in the custody or under the control of the accused, except that torture shall not include pain or suffering arising only from inherent or incidental to lawful sanctions. Now, why I wanted really to focus on the torture. Torture, before it becomes part of the International Criminal Court jurisdiction, it is called international jurisdiction. International meaning, especially in Europe, talking about 27 countries or 28 countries including the UK, they are all obliged to take any case involve torture against any human across this world, even if the perpetrator is not really holding the citizenship of the country. For example, an Israeli officer, whether civilian or army officer, will be taken to the courts in any of those countries if any case was built against him, yes, and he will be considered to be a war criminal according to this kind of international law rules. So tell me in how many times that, yeah, the one who asked, is it that Rome Statute? Yes, it is. But how many times we took, as Palestinians, any case against Israeli army officers in those countries? None. None. And this is, by the way, available in the hands of the Palestinians since ever. since the Israeli occupation started. We are documenting a lot of cases, but unfortunately we are not utilizing or using this on the legal capacity. And this is very important to remember, that this is not just about International Criminal Court, it's not about Geneva Convention, it is something called international jurisdiction. So everyone, even individually, by the way, but I know that individuals wouldn't be able to do so because simply it's a bit costly. So BLO, Hamas, other Palestinian factions, and the Palestinian Authority, they have a full responsibility of documenting all these cases and to prosecute. And you remember, it's part of the lecture how we can prosecute the Israeli occupation, and this is one of the most important parts. And for some people, because the names of the perpetrators are not really known, but you can take ministers, you can take army leaders, you can take high-ranking officers as well, to at least you restrict the free movement of the Israeli officers. They don't feel free of doing this without any punishment and without any prosecution. In addition to that, there is a high possibility of actually asking for compensation. In addition, for example, if it happened in Britain, the British authority has the duty, the legal duty of detaining those people and sending them to the court, and this should happen all the time. And this is something we are really missing all the time along the occupation, or since the occupation existed, and something Palestinians should consider very seriously in leading a very organized legal actions against the Israelis in Europe, at least when it comes to the torture. And I know that we have thousands of cases, at least hundreds of them can be materialized and utilized according to the international law jurisdiction. Now, rape, sexual slavery, we have very hardly to hear some cases like this. Prosecution or persecution against any identifiable group or collectively on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender as defined in paragraph 3, or other grounds that are universally recognized. When we say universally recognized here, would refer really to the customary international law, which we have discussed the last lecture when we were talking about the terms, the effects of the terms, and about the sources of the international law. In connection with any act referred to, universally recognized as impermissible under international law. So any act done or practiced by the Israelis which is recognized by the international law in its wide and broad meaning would be considered to be a crime against international law. So it can be taken to the International Criminal Court. In connection with any act referred to in this paragraph, or any crime within the jurisdiction of the court, means the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights, like the basic human rights, contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group. Of course, they are doing this based on the reason of the identity, because we are Palestinians and they are calling all the time for a Jewish state, pure Jewish state based on race. So they are actually treating us in this way based on our race as Arabs, because they say Arabs and they say Jews, to the group, or collectively enforced disappearance of persons. Any disappearance of persons as well could be taken, and I know that we have hundreds of cases in Palestine. The crime of apartheid means inhuman acts of a character similar to those referred to in paragraph 1 committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other, Jews against Arab, other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. Other inhuman acts of a similar character intentionally causing a great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health. So we can see that when it comes to the apartheid, I think the Palestinians, although they are repeating this in the media all the time, talking about like existed apartheid regime, but unfortunately we are not doing enough to consider it to be like a definitive. We define the Israeli, because we have thousands of documented cases which show and prove that Israel is an apartheid regime, and this is, by the way, according to many of the international rules, is considered to be by itself one of the most dangerous crimes against the humanity itself. And then we have to consider that Israel is very easy to be actually to be considered as running an apartheid regime, and this will attract a lot of countries, enforce a lot of countries actually to be part of the boycott, official boycott against Israel, because they will be implementing the law. But I think still Palestinians not just not doing enough, I think they are doing nothing with this regard. War crimes, defining the war crimes. War crimes means grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. Remember the link, the connection between Geneva Conventions and International Criminal Court. So grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of August 1949, namely any of the following acts against persons or property protected under the provisions of the relevant Geneva Convention. So this is where Geneva Convention becomes one of the most important international law and regulations to be considered by the Palestinians, because it's considered by this international criminal court to be its reference with considering the war crimes. Whenever the war crimes are mentioned, then for Palestinians we should consider and raise the questions related to the Geneva Convention. Willful killing, the assassination out of law, as it happened with many of our leaders and not leaders even. Torture or inhuman treatment, as with what's happening with the prisoners and not prisoners even, including biological experiments. Willfully causing great suffering, as it's happening almost every single day, or serious injury to body or health. Extensive destruction and appropriation of property, and this is happening almost every day in Jerusalem and in the other areas, in the areas called B and C, not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly. Compelling a prisoner of war or other protected person to serve in the forces of a hostile power, and this is related to the spies sometimes, or to the agents, jawasis. They might be considered even by this law as breaking or breaching the international law, and as a result the Geneva Convention of 1949. Other serious violations of the laws and customs applicable in the international armed conflict, which is referred again to the Geneva Convention, within the established framework of international law, namely any of the following acts: intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population. As we said, this is happening quite regularly, especially after 2002. As such, or against individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities, which is related to usually the people who are not fighting, but they are treated in a very as part of the armed forces or fighting forces, intentionally directing against the civilian objects, that is objects which are not military objectives, destroying the cars, destroying the shops, destroying the vehicles, everything really, or anything related to any civilian equipment or equipment for civilian use. Intentionally directing attacks against personnel, installations, material, units, or vehicles involved in a humanitarian assistance, like what happened with the Red Crescent and Red Cross as well, or peacekeeping missions, like what's happening with UNRWA schools, UNRWA vehicles, and so on, involved in humanitarian assistance or peacekeeping missions in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. And here, if I want to pay your attention, if you remember, we said the resolutions issued or released by the General Assembly of the United Nations are recommendatory. They are not obligatory. You remember that. Now, when it comes to the International Criminal Court, anything breaking or breaching or will be considered to be as a breach of the Charter of the United Nations, one of them, of course, dealing with the conflicts by force or military force, like what Israelis are doing against the Palestinians, will be considered to be a war crime. And this is where we can say that the Israeli occupation is a continuous war crime. And this is something I think the Palestinians should use widely and commonly in every single statement they release, whether regarding to the legal situation of Palestine or to the political situation with the other countries, especially the focus on Europe. They have to remind the international community, the European countries, that occupation is a continuous or ongoing war crime. And this is whether we're talking about settlements or attacks of the civilians or just the existence of the Israeli occupation, because it's considered the same by the courts. Intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that such attack will cause incidental loss, even by accident, of life or injury to civilians or damage to civilians object or civilian objects, or widespread long-term and severe damage to the natural environment. Every day we have a lot. Well, Gaza now doesn't have really clean water in few years time. It will be like invalid for the human being's life. And this is something very important to be considered and to be taken under the international law. And just by this case, it is enough for the Palestinians to go for this criminal court and to treat the Israelis to be war criminals. This is very important, where the Israelis by then would really find any way just to avoid this, and at least to give the Palestinian in Gaza some facilities to deal with the water crisis. And of course, attacking or bombarding by whatever means towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings which are undefended and which are not military objectives. And this is something you all know, and this is something we are not really still dealing with it to be one of our main objects when we fight against the occupation. Killing or wounding a combatant, anyone was fighting, to be killed after the arrest, and this is unfortunately happening from time to time with Palestinians having laid down his arms or having no longer means. Many of the Palestinians were arrested and then they were killed after the arrest. Making improper use of a flag of a truce, of the flag or of the military insignia and uniform of the enemy or the United Nations. This is something like far from the Palestinian situation, but I thought it's good just to shed light on it. That transfer directly or indirectly by the occupying power of parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. Just this is really reminding us in what we were discussing and mentioning about the Geneva Convention, because we were saying the same, and we were saying how much important or how important to consider and to focus on the Geneva Convention, because it seems to be fully adopted by the International Criminal Court to consider every breach of that convention to be as a war crime. And war crime, it is something really very serious, and we know that in the former Yugoslavia we have now a lot of leaders of the Serbs actually sentenced for life, some of them even still under warranty, so they are chased by the international forces and so on. So it is something very important really to be considered when it comes to the Geneva Convention and the International Criminal Court. In addition to that, we have to be very organized as Palestinians, because whatever I say here, whatever you say by yourself, even spreading the word, even talking with people, lecturing on them, attending workshops, writing papers in conferences and so on, it wouldn't be as effective as if it is taken seriously by practical steps. The courts in Europe, especially with regard to the torture, and as I said, we have thousands of cases we can work on, or to take it to the International Criminal Court, where we have as well thousands of cases which can really put the Israelis in a very serious position, at least when it comes to imprisoning them within their own state. So they can't move freely, they can't feel that they are really like tolerated or forgiven, or no one is chasing them or prosecuting them. So at least if you can't do anything physical against them, then legally you will be putting them in a very critical position, and the people would be more aware that we are dealing with war criminals rather a people who are in charge in a democratic army, as they try to promote themselves all the time. But we certainly have to have a group of lawyers, well-trained lawyers who know about the history, the historical background, know about the legal terms, and knowing about the international jurisdiction. And we have to have an agreement among all the Palestinian parties in really taking the Palestinian case to the International Court, as we are now considered or recognized to be a member of the United Nations. And this is the only condition really for us to go and to take the case for the International Criminal Court. But we have to be very organized, and we have, and as I said, using this from Europe, I think would save the Palestinians a lot of hassles. And believe me, many, they would argue that, you know, it needs a lot of money, it needs a lot of lawyers are there, money could be provided by a lot of people, because a lot of people here across Europe very sympathetic with the Palestinians. They are happy to pay money, they are happy to donate, they are happy to contribute physically and financially. Then it becomes a public case. First of all, the public opinion will be interested in this, and secondly, the Israelis would be considered to be criminals wherever really they go, because every Israeli or every adult Israeli is surfacing or has a service in the army, then they all will be under the spot wherever they go. this is how it should work. But to what extent we are doing this, I think you are in better position to answer the question more than I do myself. And up to here, I am kind of done. Of course, much more. Be very selective to choose, although sometimes it's a bit boring, but I thought it's very important to focus on many different aspects, talking about the practical issues which they are forgotten by the Palestinians and thinking it's becoming just, you know, rather neglected, not used, not useful, and they wouldn't really offer the Palestinians a good deal. But in my opinion, as you might have already concluded, if they are properly used, they would be, I wouldn't say very effective, but at least they would be effective to some extent where the Palestinian at least can be benefited from this. And for here and right now, I have to just to shut up for a while and to wait for equal questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nihadno. May Allah save you and give you power to continue talking and teaching
my best.
great values like these. Dear students, mashallah, Dr. Nihad. Dear students, if you have
Yes,
any
please,
questions,
I'm
please
really
write
more
it in
than
the
happy
chat
to
area.
answer any question, whatever the complication of this question. Just go ahead and ask.
If anyone can't make the question
fine.
in English,
It's
write
fine.
it in Arabic.
Arabic,
Dr.
English.
Nihad is
Thanks a lot,
Palestinian.
Hayat. Thank you.
Dr. Nihad, tell any student ask any question, I will ask about the Jewish state. Is the Jewish state, can it be legal?
A Jewish state.
To have a Jewish state in Palestine?
It is actually against every single
Jewish state.
international regulation for just one reason, because the United Nations Charter, yes, is condemning the establishment of any state based on the racial or ethnic or religious basis. So if we are talking about Israel as a Jewish state based on the religious dimension, this is against the charter. And if we are talking about their theory of having all the Jews across the world related to the same ethnicity, race, yes, still we are talking against the international law. So in both cases, it's illegal. It's illegal. It's firm. It's confirmed. And if you can notice in the Geneva Conventions and then in the International Criminal Court, they were talking a lot about the crimes related to the racial, to the ethnicity, to the color, and so on. So it's not something really would be considered to be a legal entity. Not at all.
Thank you, Dr. Nihad. Another question. Hamas as a terrorist organization.
Well, Hamas is not legally, now talking about legally,
to the criminal court
to be a criminal, a terrorist organization, first of all. Secondly, Hamas, because in Europe they are dealing with Hamas in different way. they are dealing with the political wing of Hamas as to be just a normal organization. But they are, some countries, they are considering the Al-Qassam brigade to be the terrorist side, exactly like what they are dealing with Hezbollah, the military side and the political side. But regardless of this consideration, Hamas doesn't need to do this by itself. They can simply delegate a lot of people to do this in Europe. In the name of Palestinians, exactly like what happened with Sharon in Spain. In Spain, he was really prevented from well, if he was really caught, he would have been arrested there because of Sabra Shatella. And the people who did that, they were individuals, like the descendants of the Palestinian victims in Sabra Shatella, but the organizations took the case to the court wasn't really Palestinian or Arab organization, they were a Spanish organization.
Yeah. As you said, spies, Israeli spies are illegal. This means that al-Asafir in the Israeli jails are illegal too. How can we put it to the criminal court? How can we
according to the International Criminal Court's rules, it would be considered to push anyone from the occupied people to work with you, and we know all of them were really subject to an exploitation and the blackmailing. So many cases, not tens of cases, maybe hundreds of thousands of cases can be taken to the court as war crimes. And this is very clearly stated in the statute of the court. So this is very easy, and I know many of them, if they know they have the tools, they will have the case for the International Criminal Court. That's all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rahad. No one asked any question. I think one of two. They understood very well, or they didn't understand anything. They didn't write any question. This means one of two. They either understand very well, or they didn't understand anything.
Okay, although still didn't, because the voice is a bit dense, is not giving really, is not giving me the clear idea of what you are saying, but I would accept whatever you said.
تمام.
في سؤال هنا، هل هناك مجموعة جهات قانونية متخصصة بمتابعة القضايا المرفوعة ضد إسرائيل في المحاكم؟ Unfortunately, both of them are not. Both of them. So we don't have organized bodies, let's say. We don't have organized groups, and we don't have even on the individual level. And we've been discussing this in one of the London TVs, Al-Hiwar, a few months back. We were talking that this is not really available, whether by official efforts or by individual efforts. Although I think it's not something, I know it needs good work and efforts, but in the same time it's not something impossible. It could be, because people here, they are very generous when it comes to the Palestinians, and especially many of them are more aware of the brutality of the Israeli occupation. So you would find a lot of support from a lot of lawyer to volunteer for these cases. They might not charge you money even, but if they charge you money nowadays in the crowdfunding, sometimes the Solidarity Campaign would ask for £100,000. They receive 200, 300,000 in just 2 days for Palestine. So there is no excuse, no justification, but you need someone with the, let's say, organizational capacity, just to avoid, because individuals will be tackled by the Israelis because they have a lot of means here to work against individuals. But against organizations, the mission will be very difficult to them. So more organizations involved in, and it did happen like in 5-6 occasions in the last 5-6 years, and they succeeded in preventing the Israeli officials, like high-ranking officials, from leaving the airport even, and now they don't come even to visit London. My pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Nihad. Any other question, please, dear students, if you have any question.
Okay, I'm waiting.
No question. Someone is trying to write something. Nothing coming.
Some money and politics are the main problems. Thank you, Doctor. Yeah, not the money. Money, as I said, is not going to be a problem. Politics, yes.
Yes.
I totally agree. But it shouldn't put the Palestinians off, and sometimes you are wondering why this is happening, because we have too many Palestinian organizations, or at least too many Palestinian charities, or charities who are very sympathetic with the Palestinian cause, but no one, I think, is pushing them to do something. But mainly, I would argue that the Palestinian Authority is not really doing much in this regard. Everyone is scared. Everyone wants to stay on power, and they think if you do any kind of efforts or move, your VIB might be taken away or something. Yeah, this kind of things I am kind of suspecting, but it doesn't mean that the other organizations shouldn't do the job in that regard. No problem.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Nihad. I think they finished.
Okay.
I think there is no other questions.
I'm very glad that
Thank you very much, Dr.
I've been joining you, and thank you for this opportunity as well.
Thank you very much. We
Allah
hope to meet you in other courses, even in Arabic.
Unfortunately, we are living in a political world, not a judicial one. Well, to some extent, it is true. But if you are in a desperate position, then you have to exhaust every single possibility. And I don't think we are really exhausting or using even 1% of the legal possibilities we are having. I'm not saying that we are gonna to stop the brutality of Israel, or to do like a huge political harm to them, but I am sure everything will help. every little thing, every little action will help. Exactly like, you know, like the children on the street who are facing the Israeli tanks, the Merkava, with their hands with the stones. Although it doesn't really destroy the tank, but in the same time it brings the Palestinian stories. It really raises the voices of the Palestinians. It is exactly the same. Although when it comes to the legal terms, the judicial terms, I think it's much more influential. Those children who are empty-handed, but from their stones, they can be heard here in the West in much better way. In much better way if they have judicial and legal support to be given to them and to their struggle against occupation. No problem.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muhad. Thank you, dear students. We were happy to have you with us in our first English course.
Not at all. It's my pleasure.
In other courses. Dr. Muhad, thank you very much. We are proud to have you in our first English course. نحكيها بالعربي. حضرتك فتحت
أنا في قمة سعادتي إني أقدم شيء أولا، ويعني أنا في غاية الشرف والسرور يعني، وإن شاء الله زي ما نقولوها إذا كان هناك أي مجال لتقديم أي شيء فسأكون في الخدمة إن شاء الله. العفو.
شكرا كثير دكتور نهاد.
لكم أيضا.
أطيب أمنياتنا لك بالتوفيق ومزيد من النجاح والتألق. Dear student, good luck in every aspect of your life. Good luck with the good information you had. We hope you can use them in your in the media, in your study. And we hope to see you one day doing something for Palestine. Thank you very much and good night.